But this is not a uniquely Catholic perspective on life. This is the lot of all of us to bring up this paradox. The things we enjoy will be the things that cause us misery and grief. We can enjoy them in the moment, it seems, but we must pay for them later. One of those jokes that people say, whether it's physical activity or eating that extra burrito. Oh, I'll pay for this later, right? The mantra of the human condition. If we find things that are truly pleasurable, highly refined, and lack the drawbacks of other lower things which they contain, then they are notoriously hard to get and exceedingly fleeting. So we settle for easy things that are effortless to acquire, but have the most terrible consequences attached to them. Now, human reason has attempted solutions to this problem on its own, inventing theories of dealing with this situation, ranging from the Manichaean, so all things are evil and are to be shunned, to the Stoic, all material things are inconsequential and to be ignored, to the Epicurean, all we really have in this world is material things, so eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But no matter how we attempt to approach this predicament, we cannot escape the overwhelming feeling that the goods of this world are at best sifting through our hands, or at worst are in open rebellion against us. Thus, in response to this reality, God has answered this stubborn puzzle of human nature in a manner supremely fitting. I use that word fitting on purpose. So this might seem like a side note, because I'm talking about desires and creation over here. So why are we going to bring up fitting? It's important. I think this is something that we talked about the entire conference long, that being careful with our words and what we mean is more than half the battle. So in theology, fittingness is a special term. It is distinct from saying that something is necessary. And this might seem odd to us, the difference between something being fitting and something being necessary. Even odder, which is not the animal, more odd. To our pious ears, it is truly the case that the sacraments are not necessary, but instead are, quote, only fitting. So you all looking doubtful at me. Good, I got you in my trap. For good Catholics, nothing could seem more necessary in their life than the sacraments. And any good priest, got one right over here, will tell you that sacraments are necessary for salvation. On one hand, what theologians call moral necessity, nothing could be more true. The sacraments are the very lifeblood of every Catholic, indeed of the Church herself. When Jesus Christ graced our world with his presence in the Incarnation, he gave us the means to be incorporated into his body, the Holy Catholic Church, and he instituted the sacraments as the perfect and morally necessary way to take part in his great gift. But in this theologically technical sense, what theologians would call metaphysical necessity, so not moral necessity, but metaphysical necessity, necessity has a very precise definition. Something that is necessary cannot help but be the case. So moral necessity means it's something we must do. Metaphysical necessity is something that cannot help but be the case. This is how they're distinct. Necessity, then, in this sense, is reserved to talk about something that could not be any other way. So when we say that a false statement is by necessity, metaphysical necessity, a statement that is not true, we are talking about things on the level of possibility and impossibility, foundational distinctions, the very fiber of the world's existence. So the fact of the matter is that the sacraments are not necessary in this sense. Quite simply, maybe even more radical to us, because salvation itself is not metaphysically necessary. It could have all happened a different way, and therefore it is not metaphysically necessary. First of all, Adam and Eve could have just not sinned. What were you thinking, Adam and Eve? Right? No, but I'm kidding, right? So that was a possibility. But even more so, after our fall from grace, God could have not saved us. God does not owe us salvation, just as God does not owe us our existence. God doesn't owe us anything. Now the secret of this, right, is this is what precisely makes God the great God that He is. God has no vested interest in you or I being saved. God saves us as pure gift, just like He had no vested interest in creating you. God could have existed and we never did. That makes our existence not necessary, but pure gift. This is the God you want to worship. A God that is by compulsion creating you, sustaining you, and saving you is really kind of just like a big mob boss in the sky who's willing to do you a favor, but only because He gets something out of it. But our God doesn't get anything out of making us, sustaining us, and saving us. It is out of pure love that He does these things, and therefore these things are all pure gift. The radicality of God's love is founded on the fact none of us, none of this is necessary. And yet, God does make us exist, does offer us salvation, and does provide us all the means we need to reach that salvation. These are all fantastically unmerited gifts from a God who has no self-interest in giving them to us. They are truly free gifts because though the sacraments are necessary to us for salvation, they are not necessary to God in the least bit. But why is this distinction then important? Why care about it at all? For starters, it answers one of the most profound questions that have troubled the Western mind about God for centuries. And this is nothing to take lightly. Most famously, this is expounded by Socrates in Plato's dialogue, The Euthyphro. The question goes like this. There's a famous Euthyphro dilemma. If you take Philosophy 101, you eventually hear about it. You might not know it by this name, but I'll give the dilemma, and you have either encountered it or heard someone give a variant of it. Are the commands of God good simply because He commanded them, or does God command what He does because they are good on their own? This is the question that Socrates pondered in the Euthyphro. Are the commands of God good simply because He commanded them, or does God command what He does because they are good on their own? If it is the former, then it is hard to imagine God as anything but a tyrant, whose command we obey by the sheer force of His will. If it's the latter, then something else is higher and outside of God, something that we owe more allegiance to than God, which renders Him nothing better than a middle manager in terms of morality. And this seems like a pretty big sticking point. What are you going to do? What are you going to do about these commands that seem to either imply that they're just the way they are because God decided on a whim, or they're decided because something actually is more important, greater, and better than God, and He's just better at selecting options? And so this sounds like a dilemma. Every person who kind of stayed awake in Philosophy 101, who decides they're a cool atheist, has thrown this to college freshmen and kept them up at night. However, Christianity uniquely answers this. In revealing Himself in Jesus Christ, God has given the definitive solution to this problem. God is the good that He wills for us. God is the good that He wills for us. So God does will the best thing being Him. So God, what He commands is not arbitrary, because it is what is best for us, but it's not outside of Him, because what He wills for us is life with Him. In willing Himself as our highest good, in revealing the commands by which we can attain this goal, communion with Him, God resolves both sides of this tension between will and reason. What God commands is what is best for us, but what he commands is not exterior to himself, because it is nothing more than communion with him. Now this matters in terms of the sacraments for a similar reason. Too often people look at the commands of the church and they just see them in an arbitrary or reductive light. On one hand, the sacraments are seen as just codified man-made rules of the church, and that stands in the way of someone's individual relationship with God. Or on the other, they are seen merely as instructional guideposts, signs that point us to an unenchanted moral code. And I know that in some of the breakout sessions this was explicitly talked about. I think it undergirds a lot of what has been said at this conference today. Because the question is, why are there these rules? Why are these rules ultimately? But instead, the sacraments are the fitting actions of a God of love. They're not arbitrary, and they're not just warmed over symbols for an unenchanted morality. They're the fitting actions of God's love, whose love is self-effusive, whose love is teeming, radiating from its source, a love that runs over the cup of the vessel that contains it. So the things that God binds us to in moral necessity for the good of our salvation, he does so himself with metaphysical freedom. So notice that what God makes necessary for us in order to return to him, he does not do out of compulsion. He does out of his radical freedom, grounded precisely because he has no vested interest in us. It is a pure gift, a pure free gift. In the sacraments we see that the Holy Trinity is both a God of love and reason all at once. He creates the sacramental order out of fittingness, out of no sense of bondage on his part. God is not bound by some code higher and outside of himself, nor does he do things at a mere whim. The church, then, as the body of Christ, is constituted by this deliberate, rational, and loving action of God. The sacraments must therefore be more than mere rules for initiation or figures for guidance enacted by some ordinary organization. Instead, they are the one and true answer to our question-laden existence, the necessary balm for the ills that are at the root of our existence, precisely because they are not necessary for God. This goes back to the idea about what fittingness means. I think we all know what necessity means, something that has to happen, and we make the distinction between moral and metaphysical. But what does it mean that something is fitting? What does it mean when something just fits? And, we've talked about beauty and truth a lot at this conference, and I think exactly of that when it comes to poems. If you've ever read a poem that is actually a poem, not just like nice words brought together, but like in rhyme, in meter, alliteration, all of these things, you realize that why a poem works is not because it makes sense, not because it's necessary, but because every word fits. Every song that we think is superior is that every word is fitting. The images fit. And it's not that you can go like a math problem. I mean, it's true that poems that follow the rules, they have, the feet are correct and the rhythmic cadence, all these things, yes. But for us, what makes them, good poems, right poems, great poems, is their fittingness. The cadence fit, the sounds fit, the words fit, the image fit. It just fits. And we read these poems and you go, why do you read them at a funeral, at a wedding? Send them to a lover. Send them to your child. Read before they go to bed. Contemplate them in your chair. As you say, because this poem alone, talking about this situation, just fits. And the best poems do that. They just fit. So fittingness, we're talking about it in a theological sense, but what I have in mind for you to dwell on is fittingness. The sacraments fit like a poem that is perfect fits. It just fits together. Thus it is the case that God has revealed to us in and through Jesus Christ and His church the most fitting answer to the problem we human beings find ourselves immersed in. Our problem, as we have noted at the start, is not that we have fallen to enemies outside of God's reach. Instead, we have taken the good things of creation, used them badly, to our own demise. This goes back to Thomas Aquinas' very basic observation that he gets from the ancients, that no one wills evil purely. They will goods poorly, disordered, in a mistaken manner, or they misunderstand what they think is a good that's truly an evil. But no one just wills evil. Humans are pathetic. They're not depravedly wicked. Another way that I always like to put this is whatever supervillain you grew up watching on TV or reading about, no human is actually like this. For me, it was He-Man, and the bad guy was Skeletor, which was just a skull that laughed, "I love doing evil." No one does that. First of all, it's bad marketing. Like, if you're evil, you don't talk about that. You don't lead with that. You don't go like, "What do you like to do, Bo?" "Evil." "Would you like to buy this product from me?" I go, "Well, no, because I remember you talking about the evil was kind of your vested interest." No, so people don't do that. Otherwise, no one would ever, that would be great, right? Like, if only that's how kids got started on drugs. "Hey, kids, want to do something evil?" "Yeah, drugs." No, that's not what works. People mistake things too low for them as something higher. Or they're in such a desperate situation they think that some said evil is the only good that they have left. No one wills evil purely. They do it mistakenly, half-heartedly, disorderly. So then the question starts to be, right, how does this God who, and look, I want to say on the side, I know that there's completely other metaphors that the Bible, the church uses about God, Jesus Christ coming and taking us away from the enemy that is the devil. And so I'm not trying to say that this rules all of this out. But in this meditation to think about the sacraments don't work like a preemptive offensive against the devil. They work precisely because we, even with the devil and the demons attacking us, we are the ones that sell ourselves into that slavery. And again, we do it through the things of the world. It would not be fitting for God to turn His back on the world because it's His world. It would not be fitting for God to throw off the material realm as pure evil because He made it good and said it was. It would not be fitting for God to strike us of our passions and desires because He put them there so that when they are well ordered, that we may delight in them. And He made them resplendent. It would not be fitting for God to strip us of our free will in order to save us because He has made us in His image, which is exceedingly, exceedingly good. Therefore, it is most fitting that God would use those very things that led us astray to save us, ourselves and the created world. Nothing fits better. The best, greatest poetic answer God gave to save man was Jesus Christ and the sacraments that He left us to be a part of His body. It's not only true, it's not only right, it's beautiful, it's the best, it just fits. It is fitting that God would institute and reveal to us the church's sacramental order as a ladder to reach Him, and that this ladder be not some alien quality in the midst of our everyday life, but that it be composed of those mundane things of creation, infused with his supernatural graces. Neither nature nor the sacraments are the result of an impersonal governing force. Both are ruled by a loving God who knows what we need. So God takes the water that we wash our faces with every morning and blesses it so it washes away sin. He takes the food we sustain our bodies with and makes it the very thing that will sustain our souls, himself. He takes the oil that we anoint ourselves with for worldly purposes and uses it to anoint us to ends we could never imagine on our own. He even takes the most mundane of all things, our very sin, and uses it as the raw material for a transformation we could never deserve in the reconciliation. In his incarnation and through the institution of his church, Jesus Christ takes the good things of this world and fills them with every grace beyond measure. The sacraments are the one and only fitting answer to the human condition. They are beautiful. They top it all off. You can't imagine a better answer. Through the sacraments, the created world no longer sifts through our hands, but aids us in reforming that which is immortal about us, our very souls. Through the sacraments, the created world is no longer in open rebellion, but becomes our greatest ally, aiding us in our journey to our one true and eternal home. So when you look at your life, do not fret that the pleasures of this world are infected with fleetingness and pain. Do not fear, because in the sacraments God has provided an answer to our most basic conundrum and provided a means for a return to the harmony and peace we all faintly remember from our ancestors' time in Eden, and that we all secretly hope for when we look at our souls and realize that we were made for heaven. And if you don't believe me in all this, you can write this down. This is where Thomas Aquinas says all of this more succinctly. It's in the Summa Theologia. It's in part 3, question 61, answer 1. So if you don't believe me, I'm not going to read all of it. We could go through all of it, but beyond Abbess Cecile, Thomas Aquinas reflects on this as well. Now this can all sound nice, but let's think about what are some objections that we might hear. And I think about caricatures of the church that people say about us, sort of as blowback to this. You guys talk about the sacraments are fitting, you think that the church loves who we are, meow, meow. Then why is it that, for instance, everyone thinks the church hates this life? You guys are prudes. You're against sex. You're against food. You're against this. You're against that. Well, the first answer I always have is like, really? Because I have 4 kids and you don't seem to have any, or maybe 1. So I don't know where you're getting about this. We don't like sex business. Food? It's like all the best food, most Catholics do and eat a lot of it. And then like people who say like, we don't like life. Italian grandmas don't even die, do they? I think they live forever. So, I mean, that sort of character is like easy to refute right out of pocket. You just like, come live with us. The standard problem with Catholics have always been loving all of those things too much. So, all you need to do is read the Inferno. But then the Puritans among us go, that's exactly right. You all love it too much. You all say about this sacramental stuff, but really you guys are just creating a veneer to feel better about how depraved you all are. So I grew up hearing both, right, from Protestant relatives, like, you guys are prudes and you hate sex, blah, blah, blah. Also, you're all drunks and, lewd and everything like that. I'm like, we're working overtime if we're doing both. So, again, I think this deep-seatedly goes back as people object to this because of our fault. You see, it's one thing to point out to the world or about the world where it's falling short. But I'm interested in all of us, and if you guys have stayed the entire liturgical conference, you're true believers. We don't need to sit here and convince you. So then the question starts being, well, what can we repent of? What have we done that I think leads people to having these misconceptions? And this is what I go back, if you guys heard the question that I said on the first night. I keep bringing it up, so I think I should try to expand on it a bit. You've probably heard me say that if we want a better Christian, we have to have a better pagan first. And what I mean by this is that, so just how history has worked, right? Humans have been pagan idol makers since they've fallen from the garden, the great temptation. In fact, in a way, the actual battle in human life is idolatry versus sacramentality. That's it. We will make idols, or we will submit to sacraments. One of the two. The problem is, idol makers can be convinced that their idols are stupid if they're tangible. So you see this in the Old Testament all the time. Your idol made of wood and stone. Someone made that. It doesn't talk. You push that idol over, that idol can't lift itself back up. When you start spiritualizing, when you start abstracting idols, those idols are much harder to kill. You start making idols out of blood or nation or even good things, family. Those are a lot harder to confront people with. And what happens with Christianity, of course, is most of the world is pagan, and the Christians come along. And they say these gods that you think are in the sky or under the ground or in Hades or in the trees or the sprites of the field or wherever they're at. We understand why you think the world is enchanted. It's been enchanted, but by God. Not by the gods, God. God the Father and the Son, the Holy Spirit. When the pagans start converting, and we were all pagans, our ancestors were before we were Christian. I mean, unless there's someone who was very Jewish in here. I think I'm 1%. I think that's on Ancestry.com. So 99% of me was pagan, old pagan. And the Christians came, and we believed in Jesus, and we started the long work of knocking the gods out of the sky and digging them up from the ground and knocking them off of their pedestal. And if you read that wonderful line of the wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales, the friars went into the fields and chased the fairies away. And this is all good if you make people stop being pagan, but you're also disenchanting the sort of world in the tangible way that people are used to it. Which is fine while you have Christendom and Christianity. But when people live in this new world bereft of the pagan gods and spirits, and then they stop being Christian, they have nothing to fall back to. The world is a giant maw consuming life. We're alone in the cosmos. No person in the ancient or medieval world would ever look at the stars and go, we're so alone. They would go, I wonder how many angels and demons and gods fit between me and the nearest star. The world was full. We've emptied the world, which shows you how powerful Christianity has been. We've emptied the world of the pagan gods. But now that people don't believe our God, there's nothing. There's nothing there. And then when you try to talk to them about deities, all they can imagine is you're either... Their responses are all Gnostic or Puritan. Gnostic or Puritan. The spiritual life is just this like, we hate what's down here and then there's some other, we don't know where because it's far away. There's no mediators to it. Or it's the Puritan response. You guys just basically have a problem, and if you just like bear down and kind of hate where... I mean, it even itself is sort of the flip side of Manichaeanism. This all pertains to worship. I've been reading Leviticus because I'm boring. And one of the things you notice about Leviticus is, again, people, even how you read it, shows that I think this is all true. We don't have enough pagan ancestral blood left to understand the heft of Leviticus. Because most people read Leviticus and like, man, this is a bunch of boring rules. They read Leviticus like it's a math book. And I read it and I go like, do you guys realize how awesome the temple would have smelled? Like, no, right? The temple would have smelled like the best barbecue restaurant ever. They were smoking meat in the temple like 24/7. The temple was awesome. Just think, like, so, okay, now I know that I'm being a little facetious, only a little, right? Because then the priests got to eat that stuff, and I'm like, wish I was a Levite, right? Yeah. Smoking meat all day, eating part of it. God loves you. Woo, right? So I give one silly example to say, okay, Bo, that sounds funny, but no one reads Leviticus and thinks smoke and blood and meat. They think rules because we think like Gnostics. The second example I give, and this goes back to worship, and I have fun fights with people about this. I mean, I very much on my sleeve wear that, like, I like going to Latin Mass. I know I'm like in a lot of converts like me, we really do like smells and bells and like really adding as much as you can. And so what I get is people go, okay, Bo, you like the Bible, you read it. What about all those psalms that say make a joyful noise to the Lord, that we're supposed to lift our hearts in praise? How is Gregorian chant lifting our heart in praise? That's what they'll throw out. And then I think back to the temple in Leviticus, and I'm not thinking people are like breaking out with tambourines, like after their hands are all bloody and they're like flipping blood around with the tambourine. But then I also think about this, right? Think about, I don't know what food you like. Steak, right? To me, that's like a whole new level steak. So you think about the best steak you ever had. And I don't mean like a good steak. I mean the best steak you ever had. The steak that made you think that maybe you had a chance in life and God loved you. That steak. And you sit down, you start chewing that steak, and it's the perfect consistency. It's completely right. And like the juices. And I've never done that and then gone, hallelujah! Like that moment of sort of like food communion was much more like Gregorian chant. Like I was moments away from going like, oh, with that moment. And so I know I'm still giving silly examples, but to be a slightly more serious one, have you ever had that first Thanksgiving like after grandma died, or the patriarch of the family died? Or it's the first meal that you've had with someone you haven't seen for years. You start to think about how food plays this really important quasi-sacramental role in so much of what we do as humans. And you think about that, like the first Thanksgiving after grandma died, and they cut the turkey, and everybody bites into the turkey. And that sort of feeling of reverence and awe and peace and contemplation. For me, fat guy who likes food is sort of pagan, that's what I think of that Mass is going after. That sort of feeling. I joke around that the only reason men watch football after the Thanksgiving meal is because it's sort of dark and you can cry a bit thinking about all of the Thanksgivings that have gone before you, right? It's like contemplation. It's like Gregorian chant. That the aim of the Mass is not exciting the easiest passions to excite, but this really deep passion that we have. And I know that I've been talking about barbecue and steak and all these things like this, but the most serious one I want to give is that last one. If you've ever had a moment where food provided, set the table for the occasion of real human community, and that you guys, maybe you had this moment too where you set down your utensils and you just sat there and no one said anything because it was perfect. Because you were all together, and grandma in some way was there. And I think that that's what the Mass is going after. Because the Mass is not, the liturgy is not, the sacraments are not information we're being told. Nor is it just this thing that's supposed to excite the easiest things to excite. It's something much deeper than that. Another way I put this, and I know like this is a little less organized than the first part of my talk, but this is what, again, when I'm thinking about people who make objections to either this understanding of the sacraments or what we said with the liturgy. You know, the outlier in human history for religion is all us, but particularly, Protestant worship specifically. I'm not trying to call them out, but I just mean in this one idea. The outlier in human history is non-bloody sacrifice. It just is. You talk about the vast majority of human history and what religion is. There's not religion without blood. And Hebrews says this, right? This is from the book of Hebrews. You get someone in a time machine from like the year 3000 BC and take them here to like one of the good old Southern Baptist revivals we had at Waukeeta, Oklahoma, 1988. They'll go, that was really nice singing, but when do the sacrifices start? They'll just be like, were we practicing? And for us, they do the same. They'd be like, where's the sacrifice? And then we'd have to explain the Mass and what the sacraments are and the sacrifice of the Mass. And they might still think we're weird, but at least they'll go, now you're talking our language. We have bloodless worship, but I don't mean it like in the paradox, right? The Catholic Church is, ours is a non-bloody blood sacrifice. But I mean that in the more poetic sense. We have bloodless worship. There's no blood in it. There's nothing behind it. It's all either mental or emotional, but there's no blood in it. And the last thing I guess we'll say is that this goes back to the very definition of the word liturgy at all. A liturgy is the work of the people, a public work. The liturgies in the ancient world were roads and aqueducts for the people, by the people. Oh, and by the way, by the people, meaning also they built it. Governors and emperors like saying, it's time to build a bridge, but they didn't really get the shovels out. The liturgy is the public work of Christ for and by the people. And it is exactly the stuff of this life, us, ourselves, made into the public body. So there's no escapism in the Mass. It is the very stuff that is us, redeemed. The perpetual sacrifice that is always being sacrificed. I always like this image. Christ keeps his wounds in heaven. You think about this in the book of Revelation. You think about when Christ appears after he's resurrected. He always has his wounds. Now why? Why does he keep his wounds? Is it just to sort of shame us, like you're in heaven, you're like, man, I don't know, God, the golf course could be better. And he's like, oh, you're right. No. He has his wounds because his sacrifice, his once and for all sacrifice, as the book of Hebrews says, it means once and for all, not like it happened once and it's done, or otherwise he wouldn't have his wounds. Once and for all, it's perpetual. He is always sacrificing himself to the Father. He does it forever. The goal of our life is to be hidden in the wounds of Christ's heart and presented before God the Father, hidden in God with Christ. So when it comes down to it, it has to be the stuff of us. It has to be of the world. It has to be not bloody like it needs to be an animal. It needs to be bloody, meaning that we put our entire being and our life in it. It has to include us, and the sacraments alone do this well, do this perfectly, the perfect poem of God answering our falling from him. And so in the end, what I think hopefully this conference has said is that, bring up what I said before, the great fight is between idols and sacraments. Idol making, sacramentology. That's it. If it's not the sacraments, that perfect thing that fits perfect and hits the nail on the head of our need and God's response, everything else is an idol. Iconoclasm isn't the answer to idol making. Re-enchantment by means of the sacraments is. And so, in the end, we praise not the necessity by which God saves us, because it wasn't necessary. It's all a free gift. We praise the fittingness of God saving us through his Son in the sacraments. Amen. Thank you.